From Antifa to the alt-right, extremist organizations are trying to rebrand themselves and their enemies in order to appear more palatable to the middle. On this episode of Just Saying, we will examine who they are and what they hope to achieve. I'm Allison Cardivold. Welcome. We're so excited that you found us and hope that you will allow us to keep you up to date on new articles and episodes by following the website at www.justsaying.com. That's GISTSAYN.com. And of course, also follow the podcast, which is available on Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, and all of your favorite platforms. So the holidays are upon us. I'm trying to get this podcast out to you before the end of the year. As a result, I am recording today in downtown Pittsburgh. So I apologize if I'm unable to edit out all of the street noise that's going on down below. But it's the season, right? They've got to rip up the streets for the holidays. So here's the gist of what we'll be talking about in this episode. Extremists are nothing new. But you need to remain educated about who's who as they evolve in their attempts to be viewed as legitimate and grow at the middle's expense. Though situated at opposite ends of the political spectrum, they have shared traits such as violent intolerance, cult-like tactics, and the use of the internet to indoctrinate and recruit new members. Many may be horrified by this observation, but extremists of the freshly rebranded alt-right and alt-left can have more in common with each other than with the people in the middle they're trying to win over. Laid upon a flat line, the far right and the far left are as far apart as the line is long, right? Each occupies the opposite frayed edge. But if you pick up that line, form a circle, and connect the frayed edges, a more accurate picture of the two extremes comes into view. Both ends are dangerous, and ignoring their existence and culpability is done at democracy's peril. Okay, so what is an extremist? First, let's define what we're talking about here. A Congressional Research Service report prepared in 2017 states that, quote, the FBI's public formulation of extremism suggests two components. First, extremism refers to an ideology outside of society's key values. And for liberal democracies, such ideologies support racial or religious supremacy and or oppose the core principles of democracy and human rights. Second, extremism can refer to the use of tactics that ignore the rights of others to achieve an ideological goal, unquote. On one of its own websites, the FBI describes violent extremism as, quote, encouraging, condoning, justifying, or supporting the commission of a violent act to achieve political, ideological, religious, social, or economic goals, unquote. A former Deputy Assistant Director of the Counterterrorism Division for the FBI, named Michael Clancy, says that the FBI investigates actions, not belief systems. On a recent FBI podcast, he said, quote, we are not the thought police. It is the psychopaths. It is the ones that are willing to take a step further to get a gun, to get a bomb, to do something. Those are the ones that I worry about, unquote. James Fields, the 21-year-old white supremacist convicted on December 7th of first-degree murder for intentionally running down Heather Heyer with his car after violent protests in Charlottesville, Virginia 16 months ago, is a prime example of the type of violent extremists the FBI is most worried about. So why do they try and rebrand? Well, the same reason other brands that have been tarnished try to. Traditionally, people gather in the middle. They want to belong and want little to do with the outcasts on the fringes. The alts are just new terms to describe old groups that have been around for generations as they evolve and look for facelifts that might make them more appealing to the middle. White supremacist organizations are fine with the name alt-right because in an effort to blend with non-racist groups whom they might share other common ground, one of their own came up with the rebrand. Far-left movements are more upset with their new designation because they feel it shifts them away from the middle Democrats towards the fringes. Whether they like it or not doesn't seem to matter. The terms are here, and their use is growing even as their meanings continue to evolve. A year ago, news organizations were directed to only use these terms when quoting others. Now they just use them. Each of these extremes likes to point at the other and claim that its doctrine is superior and that for everyone else's safety, the other needs to be destroyed. Yet, from philosophies to tactics, each draws from the other's well-worn playbooks. For almost 2 decades, Islamic terrorist jihadists, both foreign and homegrown, have been the extremists to garner the lion's share of national attention. The attacks on 9/11 brought them to the forefront, and continued attacks, such as the Boston Marathon bombers, kept them there. This, however, has not always been the case. Historically, other extremist movements have dominated the public's attention. In the 60s and 70s, it was radical left organizations like the Black Panthers Party and the Weather Underground that dominated headlines with threats and acts of violence in protest of the Vietnam War and support of Black Power and New Communism. In the 80s and 90s, the most familiar strand of extremists in the United States were of the white supremacist ilk. There has always been a need to track the evolution of these extremes. My first introduction to the world of extremists was in the summer of 1988, when as an intern I accompanied KXLY's lead reporter to what was billed as an annual Aryan World Congress. It was a gathering in North Idaho of white supremacists, separatists, skinheads, and Klansmen from across the United States and beyond. And truthfully, it kind of blew my mind because I grew up not very far from there, and I was just appalled and floored that this could be happening so close to a place that I loved. In the 80s and 90s, a man named Richard Butler, leader of the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, or Aryan Nations as it was known, was able to do what few before him had accomplished in the white racist corner of extremist movements. He gathered various racist organizations, plus those based on more anti-government views from across the country together, at least briefly, under one umbrella. The retired aeronautical engineer was a neo-Nazi that preached that if you weren't white, you were subhuman, and he dreamed of establishing an all-white homeland in America's Northwest. A lot of very bad people passed through his organization, who went on to do horrendous things, including counterfeiting, bank robbery, bombings, and murder. Butler, however, was always able to keep a degree of separation between himself and those acts of violence that many believe he had instigated or at least encouraged. Though he periodically faced serious criminal charges, he was never convicted of anything more than trespassing. Eventually, the FBI was able to dismantle the largest, most violent, and vocal advocates of this extreme racist and anti-government doctrine. This was done, at least in part, by tracking those that passed through Butler's doors. But like other successful cultish leaders, he himself avoided conviction. Butler's reign was effectively ended not by criminal charges, but through a civil court case brought by Morris Dees and his Southern Poverty Law Center that left Butler bankrupt. I sat through every day of that trial and did a documentary about the end of Richard Butler's Aryan Nations. During that same time period, I drove to the mountains of Montana to interview the armed leader of the militia of Montana, John Trockman. In addition, I witnessed protesters bust in from out of state as neo-Nazi white supremacists converged in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, to clash at a parade that locals avoided like the plague. I interviewed civil rights organizers who worked tirelessly to try and keep hate and racial tensions at bay. And in 1992, I was also at the debacle that came to be known as Ruby Ridge in North Idaho, where the government's attempts to recruit a self-sequestered separatist ultimately cost the lives of a U.S. Marshal, a teenage boy, and a mother who was shot by an FBI sniper while she held her infant child. The separatist, Randy Weaver, eventually won a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the government. The events at Ruby Ridge, along with the government's raid of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco the following year, are reported to have fueled militant anti-government extremist Timothy McVeigh's anger and distrust of the government and pushed him to act. Inspired by a blueprint laid out in the Turner Diaries, an anti-government novel by neo-Nazi William Pierce, McVeigh executed the then largest terror attack in U.S. history. On the morning of April 19th in 1995, an explosion ripped through all 9 floors of the federal building in Oklahoma City. The truck bomb, built, planted, and detonated by McVeigh, also damaged or destroyed 300 surrounding buildings and inflicted massive human casualties. In all, more than 650 people were wounded, and 168 people, including 19 young children, were killed. In its day, Butler's approach worked, but it was also easy to track. The FBI used his large gatherings and celebrated leadership to identify white supremacist and anti-government groups across the country. After the Oklahoma City bombing, breaking apart right-wing extremist organizations became a priority. After 9/11, the splinters that remained scurried to the shadows and the internet, content to focus their hate on a new enemy, at least for a while. It's important to note, too, that as successful as Butler was, the numbers involved in his and related movements were nothing compared to those of the KKK at its height, which you might be surprised to learn was not during the Reformation, but was in the 1920s, when it had rebranded itself as a fraternal organization and social club. In the mid to late 1920s, the Klan's paying membership, yes, those actually shelling out money to be involved, was touted to be anywhere from 2 to 8 million white Protestant, largely middle-class Americans. In August of 1925, 50,000 regalia-clad members of the Ku Klux Klan marched unmasked through Washington, D.C. Unmasked because officials would not otherwise allow the march to take place. They wouldn't give them a permit. The Southern Poverty Law Center estimates that today there are between 5,000 and 8,000 Klan members in the United States. And these numbers are split between dozens of different and often warring organizations that each use some variation of the Klan name. The point here is that the white supremacy movement in the United States is withered, but its frustrated remnants remain dangerous. In the 2000s, there have been deadly attacks carried out by individuals who profess beliefs of white supremacy and anti-Semitism, the most recent being the deadly attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. But often these perpetrators lay claim merely to the ideology, not any one specific group. They are lone actors who are now commonly radicalized online and are very hard to detect ahead of when they commit their act of violence. As was the case with the left-leaning gunman who targeted and shot several people at the Republican congressional baseball practice in 2017. So let's focus for a bit on the alt-right, and let me try and give you a definition of what they are. Since being driven to the shadows in the late 1990s, few leaders have willingly taken to the spotlight for the racist white movement. The most prominent recent exception to that is a well-spoken, calculated millennial comfortable with the likes of predecessor David Duke. American white nationalist leader Richard Spencer is the man who popularized the phrase alt-right, short for alternative right. It is a loose contemporary term referring to multiple unaffiliated far right-wing groups primarily made up of white men whose ideology aligns more with white supremacy and white nationalism than mainstream conservative thought. White nationalists say they seek to ensure the survival of the white race and the cultures of traditionally white ethnic groups. They believe that white people should maintain their majority in majority white countries, continue their political and economic dominance, and that white cultures are superior. In recent years, the movement has picked up momentum through content and memes posted and passed around on message boards and social media, and it is reported to have been emboldened by the election of President Donald Trump. Richard Spencer is concerned with optics, but make no mistake, he is a white supremacist. Unlike many with his beliefs, he will smile and have a cordial conversation with anyone, no matter what their race, and he doesn't overtly promote violence. On the contrary, he is disciplined enough to stand in front of screaming hordes of university students and claim all he wants is the opportunity to invoke his First Amendment rights and have a conversation. These unruly crowds, plus the Antifa member who sucker punched him while he was being interviewed on the streets of Washington, D.C. during the presidential inauguration in 2016, gave him both victim status and street cred. In short, they helped make him famous. Freedom of speech and equality, not white supremacy, are now his best recruitment tools. He had already softened his supremacy message by saying things like identity matters and that he just wants to be as smart as African Americans when it comes to the use of identity. He poses the question, why should I be ashamed of who I am? However, he will also go on to say, quote, I want to bathe in white privilege, unquote. And he says he dreams of bringing it back and of having an all-white America through a, quote, peaceful ethnic cleansing, unquote. I watched one of his attempts to speak at a college campus on YouTube. By a show of hands, the division of those that were there to protest and those interested in what he had to say was at least 20-1. By yelling him down before he even had a chance to speak, I guarantee you, the ones there to hear what he had to say were pushed directly into his arms. The ones that were already there feeling like a misfit, an outsider, they had just found a home. Personally, I believe a much more productive solution would be to listen to and try to understand why those students who had come to listen to him were there in the first place. Keep in mind, understanding and agreement are two different things. You can understand someone without agreeing with them. I once watched a young man transform in a matter of minutes from being a curious bystander to a rioter. He had excitedly come to try and get a glimpse of then President Bill Clinton, who was in town for the World Trade Organization Summit. While walking back to catch his ferry home, he was pepper sprayed by police as they chaotically chased protesters through the streets of downtown Seattle. After protesters washed out the young man's eyes, he was so enraged by the unwarranted attack police had perpetrated on him that instead of going home, he joined the protesters. Was he an anarchist? No. But he at least now had empathy for them. In August of 2017, a rally called Unite the Right was to be held in Virginia. Organizers claimed their goal was to unify the American white nationalist movement and to oppose the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee from Charlottesville Emancipation Park, the latter of which had garnered some support from non-racists on the right. The night before the rally, however, a procession of about 250 white supremacists marched across the campus of the University of Virginia, holding torches and reciting racist chants. The imagery evoked symbolic connections to Hitler Youth marches and clan gatherings of days gone by, and it set the stage for a deadly confrontation. The next day, after being pepper sprayed at the extremist rally he helped organize, Richard Spencer was ready to play up his victim card, telling viewers of David Duke's live stream of the event that rally-goers had been set up by the government, which allowed their peaceful gathering to be attacked by communist-leaning counter-protesters. Violent skirmishes between swastika-bearing rally-goers and Antifa flag-waving counter-protesters resulted in at least 30 people being injured and did go unchallenged by police until the situation was declared a riot and the rally was canceled before it could officially begin. Spencer's claims, however, were voiced before he got word that one of the participants from his gathering, a self-identified white supremacist, had driven through a crowd of counter-protesters as they were leaving, killing 32-year-old Heather Hare and seriously injuring at least 19 others. On Friday, December 7th, 21-year-old James Fields, Jr. was convicted of first-degree murder for Hare's death and now faces life in prison. Fields, who traveled from Ohio to attend the Unite the Right rally, was also convicted of 9 other charges, including aggravated malicious wounding and leaving the scene of a fatal accident. He will likely face federal charges as well. Unite the Right held an anniversary rally this year in Washington, D.C. The rally's turnout consisted of no more than 30 participants amidst thousands of counter-protesters. So it's important to keep things in perspective. Even though we have horrific acts that are carried out by some of these people, the active white supremacists in the United States, there are far fewer of them than there have been historically. If you go to the website and look at the accompanying article, you can see not only, as always, the links to things that I have researched to do this podcast, there's also some graphs by a study that was recently put out. And one of those charts shows that we actually have far fewer terrorist acts now than there were in the 1970s. But the deadly results of the tragic events at Charlottesville and now the mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh that killed 11 people, they damaged the attempt by Spencer and others to rebrand their movement as a kinder, gentler white supremacy. And it pushed middle-right sympathies further from their reach. Robert Bowers, the truck driver who didn't finish high school, was not a formal member of an extremist organization. His anti-Semitic attitudes appear to be the result of an immersion into extremist theories circulated online, which is where he also shared his own hateful thoughts fueled by growing frustration that no one was heeding his opinions. His last post on Gab.com is believed to be aimed at the alt-right movement he once hoped would embrace him. Shortly before the shooting in Pittsburgh, he wrote, quote, "Screw your optics, I'm going in," unquote. As much as these tragedies hurt the alt-right streams to become normalized and accepted by the middle, they helped legitimize the alt-left rise of Antifa. So now we're going to try and explain to you, what is Antifa? According to a Rolling Stone article written right after the deadly events, anti-fascists' view of Charlottesville and the president's remarks stating that fault for the violence there could be found on both sides, they view that as a watershed moment for their cause. One anti-fascist group leader who was present at Charlottesville and who has participated in Black Bloc activity in cities up and down the East Coast since Trump's election told Rolling Stone, quote, "On our side, it's war. Expect greater support from average people. A lot of quote-unquote normal people and libs who would have told us to F off and stop being so upsetting are now crossing over to our side. We are seeing a new wave of membership coming in," unquote. So again, Despite their overall depleted numbers, fear of a revival and the universally evil reputation of neo-Nazi, fascist, anti-Semitic white supremacists are being used as a battle cry for an extremist coalition of alt-left actors under the moniker of Antifa. The current Antifa movement in the United States is comprised of multiple autonomous left-wing groups loosely affiliated by their militant opposition to fascism, white supremacy, and other forms of ideology they believe to be right-wing, including law enforcement, capitalism, and democracy. Participants in this movement are predominantly communists, socialists, radical environmentalists, and anarchists. A principal feature of those gathered under this political umbrella is the group's desire to take what it calls direct action, using harassment and violence against those they oppose. Antifa does not believe in the right of free speech for those they target. Adherents feel that offensive speech and ideas should not be given a platform, at least ones they disagree with, and that violence is justified to deny access to those who would speak it. The latest incarnation of Antifa denounces a hierarchical leadership and instead uses social media and the internet to organize small groups already familiar with one another called affinity groups. The movement's purposely fragmented and decentralized structure makes it hard for outside provocateurs to infiltrate and helps keep organizers and those who aim to misbehave anonymous and free from reprisal. During protests, members often employ the use of black bloc, which is a tactic, not an organization. By dressing all in black and wearing masks, the protesters can be easily identified as a group, but not as individuals. In addition to covering groups like the Aryan Nations and the Militia of Montana in the 1990s, I also ran across some of those who helped lay the foundation for this current movement as anarchists and Antifa groups at the World Trade Organization riots in Seattle and the G20 in Pittsburgh. Translated from the Greek, anarchy means without a leader. Ultimately, what pure anarchists want to achieve is a stateless society with horizontal consensus versus hierarchical leadership. It should come as no surprise, though, that since anarchists reject authority, there are many types of anarchism, ranging from ones that promote absolute individual liberty to those that endorse more communist or socialist ideas. Consensus, even among a few, can be hard to come by, but they do agree that the use of violence is acceptable. The first time I saw them in action was as I dodged pepper spray and concussion grenades during the World Trade Organization riots in 1999. I watched black bloc-clad anarchists sabotage otherwise peaceful protesters. There weren't that many of them, but they would mingle in among other marchers who were there to save the whales and the turtles, or union members who didn't want to lose their jobs due to globalization. And time and again, the ones who were breaking things were the ones in black. For days, they squatted in a multi-story downtown building that was under renovation, denying entrance to its legal owner even after he went to the police. While staking out the building, I saw authorities do their own reconnaissance. But since the mayor had welcomed protesters into town, it was determined that City Hall preferred not to clear the building by force. Even back then, force is what it would have taken. The lookouts that manned the barricade entrances and the rooftop perches told me that much themselves. I went out on the street and talked to them. At the time, I found it odd that as self-described anarchists, they were so organized. That was because I was unfamiliar with anarchy as a political philosophy. Another thing I didn't know then was that I was witnessing the foundation being laid for the Antifa movement we see today. In 2009, at the G20 summit in Pittsburgh, they were still identifying themselves primarily as anarchists, but by that point they had been recruiting people with other left-wing ideologies to join them, such as radical environmentalists. In Pittsburgh, those dressed in black bloc were still in the minority, and they once again infiltrated a cornucopia of other causes represented by peaceful protesters. I walked among the marchers for miles straight through the center of Pittsburgh, where the streets were lined with more law enforcement than there were protesters of all causes combined. The permitted march remained peaceful. The violence occurred at side protests near Lawrenceville and at night near the University of Pittsburgh campus. When dumpsters were set on fire and windows were broken, it was those dressed in black bloc leading the way. By the time of the 2011 Occupy movement, anarchists were beginning to question their alliance with the more peaceful far-left activists, and by the time they reached full momentum during the 2014 police brutality riots in Ferguson, anarchists were being overrun by those allies. Longtime anarchist author and strategist Tom Nomad, who believes that capitalism is not sustainable, had this to say about challenges autonomous and anarchist movements now face on a recent appearance on the anarchist podcast, It's Going Down. He said, quote, "When we engage in single-issue campaigns, the things that end up resulting from that are not the kinds of escalations that we hope for. What ends up happening is that the liberals compromise, and we get left out on our own. And what we need to figure out as anarchists is how to break that dynamic. Because for a long time, almost 20 years ago, we had to rely on the liberals because they had the capacity to organize. During the 2005 period when we started doing counter-recruitment, we didn't have to rely on them anymore, and we built our own infrastructure. I think what is happening now is the amount of people coming to the radical politics right now is in a lot of ways outpacing the infrastructure that we built, and we need to figure out how to deal with that," unquote. The willingness of more and more liberals to embrace far-left radical policy and practices swells the movement's ranks, but it also runs the risk of fracturing it. In order to accommodate each group's single identity issues, the definition of their enemies gets broader and broader. However, this can also legitimize the movement in the eyes of centric non-activists, and that makes it easier for extremists to piggyback their less palatable goals onto the broader ones, at least for a while. Even though their final destination may not be the same, far left and right activists and extremists don't seem to mind using each other to help shift popular thinking a few stops further along their ideological track. Anti-fascism has been around since before World War II, ever since Benito Mussolini came up with fascism. The original Antifa spread from Italy to Germany and Spain in an effort to resist Adolf Hitler's brown shirts and Francisco Franco's nationalist army. Its tactics have also been a regular fixture employed by socialists to combat dictators in Latin America. Antifa reemerged in the 1970s and 80s in Britain in response to a vocal skinhead movement. As the skinhead movement spread to the United States, so came Antifa. Anti-Racist Action, or ARA chapters, sprang up around the country after battling the neo-Nazi skinheads in Minnesota's Twin Cities. These battles were often staged amidst the clubs and venues of the punk rock scene. In an era that predated the internet and the 24-hour news cycle, a large portion of Americans remained oblivious to their skirmishes. In the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing, intense nationwide scrutiny was placed on the white supremacy and anti-government movements. As a result, the FBI dismantled its hierarchy and the movements lost momentum and dissipated. Without obvious nails to hammer, the ARA did the same. In the Merriam-Webster dictionary, fascism is defined as a political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts national and often race above the individual, and that stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. Those that make up this latest reincarnation still call themselves Antifa, but this time around their enemies are not just fascists. On its Facebook page, Northeast Ohio Antifa says, anti-fascist action focuses on the struggle against all authoritarian ideologies and groups promoting any kind of oppression. It's a broader definition, just right there. Now Antifa reaches beyond members of the white supremacy movement to label anyone it disagrees with as a racist, anti-Semitic, fascist, Nazi. This range now encompasses anybody from unwitting bystanders that fail to heed Antifa's directions when they block access to city streets and sidewalks to the President of the United States. The center tenet of anonymity makes it difficult to determine the movement's numbers, but thousands have shown up at protests like those at Berkeley in 2017, and members of the Rose City Antifa in Portland, Oregon, which is the oldest current Antifa organization in the United States, they routinely flood the city's center to protest racism, police brutality, and immigration officials. At the direction of Portland City Hall, skirmishes between Rose City Antifa and members of far-right groups such as Patriots Prayer and the Proud Boys, who all take to the streets spoiling for a fight, go largely uninterrupted by police and spill onto unsuspecting residents. Neighboring authorities are amazed that things have yet to escalate beyond fists and clubs to knives and guns. Letting both sides go unchallenged, they fear, is a mistake. The anarchist Nomad says that in the Trump era, people are rushing from outrage to outrage to outrage. He believes this is causing everyone from left-leaning moderate Democrats to the more traditional anarchists to become very frantic and lose sight of what they're really trying to achieve. He says, quote, "What it's led to is a lot of burnout and a lot of fragmentation," unquote. As a recent study done by START indicates, which you can see in the article on the website, which extremist movement is more active or violent in the United States has changed from decade to decade. With 24-hour nationwide news coverage, you might think this is the most volatile time in our history, but in truth, it is not. Numbers are up slightly from the year before, but the frequency of terror-like attacks is down sharply from where it was in the 1970s. And if we look back even further, it's clear that we have faced other periods of disruptive violence. For example, in the Gilded Age of America's late 1800s and early 1900s, it was the anarchists with the strong socialist leanings that took advantage of the invention of dynamite to unleash a bombing campaign aimed to destroy capitalism and the elite democratic state. On May 4, 1886, the Haymarket Square bombing, riot, and gun battle that started as a Union rally in Chicago left at least 11 people dead, with many more wounded. Ultimately, 8 anarchists were convicted of crimes, 4 of which were sent to the gallows. Another one killed himself the night before he was to be hung, and then 3 of them ended up having their sentences commuted later on. It was a socialist anarchist that assassinated President William McKinley in 1901 for being an, quote, enemy of the people, unquote. In 1908, the New York Times reported that anarchists and others were setting off a bomb a month in New York City. In 1910, anarchists tried but failed to kill Attorney General Mitchell Palmer and to blow up the St. Patrick's Cathedral. And in September of 1920, they succeeded in setting off a bomb on Wall Street that killed 30 people. It is important to recognize that though they fight for opposing sides, extremists have always shared many of the same traits. These include the willingness to use violence, an intolerance of any differing opinions, and the desire to be considered legitimate. Each shares a reliance on groupthink, and they will often use cult-like tactics to achieve it. Another commonality is their use of the internet to organize, recruit, and indoctrinate new members. I witnessed Richard Butler's tactics in action. He gathered misfits and outcasts, instilled in them a sense of belonging, gave them someone to blame for their troubles, in his case, Israel and Jews, focused their hate on those deemed inferior, in his case, anyone not white or who dared to disagree with his teachings, which again, in his case, were wrapped in a cloak of religion. According to the Harvard professor I interviewed back then, the format was classic cult. I interviewed a young man more than once while I was doing my documentaries, as he was transformed from a wayward youth in search of a family, ambiguous to race, to a professed true believer who went to prison for trying to protect Butler from an imagined threat. The human need to belong runs deep and can be easily manipulated by those who are morally unencumbered. Leaders of extreme movements don't always share the same fanatic beliefs they inspire. Instead, for them, the movement, whatever the movement, is about procuring power. The FBI says that any combination of the need for power, excitement, affiliation, purpose, importance, and achievement also play into the personal needs people are trying to fill when they become violent extremists. An online FBI statement reads, quote, "No single reason explains why people become violent extremists, but it often happens when someone is trying to fill a deep personal need. For example, a person may feel alone or lack meaning and purpose in life. Those who are emotionally upset after a stressful event also may be vulnerable to recruitment. Some people also become violent extremists because they disagree with government policy, hate certain types of people, don't feel valued or appreciated by society, or they think they have limited chances to succeed," unquote. The Tree of Life synagogue accused shooter Robert Bowers fits this bill. He also fits into the lone wolf formula currently prevalent in many extremist organizations. He is not part of any formal organization with a command structure, yet was connected to a community built around shared ideas, based on contemporary debates, and appears to have been radicalized completely online. Joe Navarro, a former FBI agent who helped found the agency's behavioral analysis program, has described the psychological profile of terrorists as, quote, wound collectors. In an interview with the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, he said, quote, "The one thing we know is that the psychology has always been the same. By that I mean you have individuals who are collecting wounds. They are looking for social ills or things that have gone wrong, and they are nourishing these things that they are identifying, that they are thinking about. The solution for them is violence," unquote. This profile applies to Bowers. It also holds true to the shooter that targeted a congressional Republican baseball practice in 2017, which ended with 4 injured and the suspect dead. Whip Majority Leader Steve Scalise was so gravely injured it took 9 surgeries to save him, and he continues physical therapy to this day, hoping to once again walk without the assistance of a crutch. The city of Alexandria's Commonwealth Attorney, Brian Porter, did a use of force investigation and analysis after the shooting. In his findings, he said, quote, "The evidence in this case establishes beyond a reasonable doubt that the suspect, fueled by rage against Republican legislators, decided to commit an act of terrorism, as that term is defined by the Code of Virginia," unquote. The lone wolf premise is different than, say, movements in the 1960s and 70s, where groups like the Weather Underground, which was far-left, anti-government, against the Vietnam War and used bombs, or the Order, who were white supremacists that refuted government's authority, robbed banks, counterfeited and bombed in the name of their organization. They did these things as a cause. Both of those groups did. Now extremists on both sides seem to prefer to operate anonymously from the internet or from behind a mask. This largely anonymous interaction can make it easier to get from contact to conversion and through the radicalization process in between. After contact comes the immersion process, where a person becomes very interested in violent extremist beliefs, no matter which side it is, and starts doing a lot of reading and research. Now that usually happens online. Once the recruit starts to understand and accept the radical ideology, he or she may become increasingly isolated during a time of identification. Indoctrination begins only after the individual fully identifies with the violent extremist ideology and is now ready for action. In an organized group, this is when the recruit may be tested during training or given a chance to prove his or her commitment by helping with an already planned violent extremist activity. Then finally, the new extremist is called to action, where they not only actively plan, but then carry out an act of violence on their own. Radicalization is when individuals come to believe that their use of violence to achieve social and political change is necessary and justified. So here's the truth about extremists that you have to be aware of. Those who look to be offended will undoubtedly find endless reasons to be offended. And when you've already justified your reply and use of violence, the rest becomes easy. The more extreme one's beliefs become, the more likely they are to become and cause the very things they profess to hate. The more hospitable and broad the middle ground is, the more people can occupy that space on both sides of the center. Civility is the fertilizer that keeps this center ground growing. Without it, it becomes barren and uninhabitable. Total agreement is not the middle's goal. With civility, a simple consensus will do. But when you collapse the middle ground, you force people to either the left or the right. On both sides, extremists wait with open arms to draw in new political initiates and indoctrinate them. In this scenario, eventually, it is the middle that becomes the fringe. With no common ground to bind them, the two sides either split or one dominates the other through violence. Neither one of those things is a very good option for democracy. But of course, you can agree or disagree, because I'm just saying. Once again, thank you for joining us for this podcast. I encourage you to follow both the website at www.gistsayyn.com or on your favorite podcast platform. Until we meet again in the new year, God bless and happy holidays.